In 1926, a French archaeologist named Alexandre Piankov was granted access to a burial chamber in the Valley of the Kings that had been sealed for over 3,000 years. The tomb belonged to a minor pharaoh whose name most Egyptologists had forgotten. Piankov was not interested in the pharaoh. He was interested in what was painted on the walls. The chamber was small, barely large enough for a man to stand upright and extend both arms. Every surface had been covered in hieroglyphic text and painted scenes rendered in pigments still unfaded. The ceiling depicted stars. The floor depicted water. The four walls depicted a journey that began at the moment of death and ended at a destination the text identified as the Field of Reeds, the Egyptian afterlife. But on the western wall, positioned at the exact point in the journey where the dead soul would encounter the brightest light in the entire painted sequence, Piankov found something that stopped him. A warning. Not a celebration of the light. Not an invitation toward it. A warning against it. The hieroglyphic text surrounding the painted light source used a grammatical construction that Piankov had seen only in texts describing traps. The determinative glyph attached to the word for light in this passage was not the sun disk. It was the glyph for a net, a snare, something designed to catch what passes through it. Piankov photographed the wall, recorded the text in his field journal, and included a single reference to it in a monograph published in 1957 by the Bollingen Foundation. The reference occupies fewer than 3 sentences. He described the passage as anomalous and moved on. No Egyptologist followed up. The tomb was resealed. The photographs sat in the Bollingen archive until the foundation dissolved in 1968, at which point they were transferred to Princeton University Library, where they sit today in a collection requested fewer than a dozen times in 50 years. What Piankov found on that wall is not unique. It is an instance of a motif that appears across at least 4 separate ancient textual traditions spanning 3 continents and 2,000 years of composition. The motif is this. At the moment of death, the soul encounters a light. The light appears welcoming. The light appears divine. And the light is not what it claims to be. If the intersection of ancient Egyptian funerary science and forbidden scriptural history is the kind of content you come here for, subscribe now. Every week, this channel goes directly to the catalog numbers, the archive translations, and the textual evidence that never makes it into the mainstream conversation. Hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is not a single book. It is a collection of approximately 190 spells, prayers, and instructions compiled over more than 1,000 years, drawn from sources that predate the unified Egyptian state. The earliest versions appear in the pyramid texts, carved into the walls of 5th and 6th dynasty tombs at Saqqara beginning around 2300 BCE. Later versions were written on papyrus and placed inside coffins. The most complete surviving copy is the Papyrus of Ani, dated to approximately 1270 BCE, now held in the British Museum under catalog number EA 10470. The purpose of the Book of the Dead was not philosophical, it was operational. Each spell was a tool designed to help the deceased navigate specific obstacles in the underworld. Spell 17 provided the words needed to pass through the first gate. Spell 125 contained the negative confession recited before the 42 judges of the dead. Spell 154 prevented the body from decaying. These were not meditations on mortality. They were instructions for surviving a process the Egyptians understood as physically real and extremely dangerous. Within this collection, a subset of spells deals specifically with the phenomenon of light in the underworld. And this is where the conventional understanding of Egyptian afterlife beliefs begins to fracture. The standard scholarly narrative presents the journey through the duat, the Egyptian underworld, as a progression from darkness toward light. The soul descends into shadow, faces trials, and eventually emerges into the radiant presence of Osiris or Ra, depending on the period and tradition. Light equals salvation, darkness equals failure. That is the framework most Egyptologists use, and popular accounts repeat. But the texts themselves are more complicated than the framework allows. Spell 164 of the Book of the Dead, which appears in a small number of late-period papyri, and was first translated in full by the German Egyptologist Carl Richard Lepsius in 1842, contains language that does not fit the light equals salvation model. The spell is addressed to a being the text calls the one who shines in the hour of confusion. The deceased is instructed not to approach this being, not to answer when it calls, not to follow the light it produces. The spell provides specific words the deceased must speak to repel the being, and those words include the phrase, "I know your face. You are not my God. You wear the light of another." That construction, "you wear the light of another," uses a grammatical form in the original hieratic that implies deception. The being is not generating its own light, it is using light that belongs to someone else. It is, in the text's precise language, wearing a borrowed radiance to attract souls that would otherwise pass safely. Spell 164 is not widely discussed in popular Egyptology. When it is mentioned, it is typically described as a late-period addition influenced by foreign magical traditions, a way of dismissing its content without engaging it. But the motif it describes, a deceptive light encountered at the threshold of death, does not originate in the late period. It appears in the Coffin Texts, which predate the Book of the Dead by centuries, and in the Pyramid Texts, which predate the Coffin Texts by centuries more. Coffin Text spell 793, translated by Adrian de Buc and published in his 7-volume edition between 1935 and 1961, contains a passage in which the deceased addresses a luminous figure blocking a corridor in the underworld. The deceased says, "I see your brightness, but I know what stands behind it. You are the face that devours those who come without knowing." The word translated as devours uses the determinative for swallowing, not destruction, consumption. The being does not destroy the soul. It takes the soul into itself. The Pyramid Texts are older still. Utterance, 534, carved into the walls of the Pyramid of Pepi I at Saqqara around 2300 BCE, describes a moment in the king's journey through the underworld where he encounters what the text calls a great shining in the narrow place. The king is told by a protective deity to close his eyes and speak words of power. The instruction is explicit. Do not look at the shining. It is not the way. It wears the face of the horizon, but it leads to the house of forgetting. The house of forgetting. That phrase appears 3 times across the Pyramid Texts and once in the Coffin Texts. In every instance, it describes a destination the soul reaches if it follows the wrong light. Not annihilation, not punishment, forgetting. The soul that enters the house of forgetting loses its name, its memory, its knowledge of who it was and where it came from. It does not die a second death. It simply ceases to know itself. This is a fundamentally different concept from the Christian hell or the Greek Tartarus. There is no fire, no torment, no judgment. There is only the erasure of identity. And the mechanism that leads to this erasure is a light the soul mistakes for salvation. Now here is where the Egyptian evidence intersects with a textual tradition that should have no connection to it at all. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, known in its original language as the Bardo Thodol, was composed in the 8th century CE by the Buddhist master Padmasambhava and was hidden as a terma, a concealed treasure text, until its rediscovery in the 14th century. The first English translation was published in 1927 by Walter Evans Wentz, an American scholar working from a Tibetan manuscript provided by Lama Kazi Dawa Samdup. The Bardo Thodol describes in precise detail what happens to consciousness in the period between death and rebirth. It divides this period into 3 phases called bardos. The first bardo begins at the moment of death. The second bardo is the period of visions. The third bardo is the period in which consciousness is drawn toward its next incarnation. In the second bardo, the consciousness encounters a series of lights. The text describes them with extraordinary specificity. First, a clear white light appears. This light, the text says, is the true nature of mind itself. It is the Dharmakaya, the fundamental ground of reality. If the consciousness can recognize this light and merge with it, liberation is achieved. The cycle of death and rebirth ends permanently. But the text warns that most consciousness cannot bear the intensity of the clear light. It is too bright, too vast, too formless. The consciousness recoils from it. And when it recoils, a second set of lights appears. These lights are softer, warmer, more inviting. They have color, they have form, they feel familiar. The Bardo Thodol calls them the lights of the 6 realms. And it warns in language that could not be more direct that these lights are traps. Each colored light corresponds to one of the 6 realms of cyclic existence. A soft white light leads to the God realm. A red light leads to the hungry ghost realm. A yellow light leads to the human realm. The lights are attractive precisely because they match the emotional habits of the consciousness encountering them. A consciousness driven by pride is drawn to the soft white light. A consciousness driven by desire is drawn to the red. The light does not force. It attracts. It feels like home. And that feeling is the mechanism of the trap. The Bardo Thodol instructs the deceased to recognize these lights as projections of their own habitual patterns and to turn away from them. The text provides specific prayers and visualizations designed to help the consciousness resist the attraction. The language is urgent. The tone is that of someone giving emergency instructions to a person in immediate danger. Do not follow the soft lights. They are not liberation. They are the doorways back into suffering. An Egyptian text from 2300 BCE and a Tibetan text from the 8th century CE describe the same phenomenon, a deceptive light encountered after death that the soul must not follow. The Egyptian version calls the destination the House of Forgetting. The Tibetan version calls it cyclic existence. Both describe a loss of identity, a loss of memory, a loss of the knowledge needed to escape. There is no historical transmission pathway connecting the pyramid texts to the Bardo Thodol. No trade route, no missionary contact, no shared literary tradition. These texts were composed on different continents in different languages, separated by more than 3,000 years. The convergence is either coincidental or it is evidential. If it is coincidental, it is the most precise coincidence in comparative death studies. If it is evidential, it points to a shared source of information about a phenomenon that both traditions treated as physically real. And then there is the Gnostic material, which adds a third independent witness. The Nag Hammadi library was discovered in December 1945 by a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. The library consists of 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts written in Coptic, the final stage of the Egyptian language. The texts date to the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, but many of them are translations of earlier Greek originals that scholars believe were composed in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Among these texts is a document called the First Apocalypse of James, catalogued as Codex 5, Tractate 3. Jesus is depicted giving James specific instructions for what will happen after death. The instructions are not theological abstractions. They are navigational commands. Jesus tells James that after death he will be confronted by beings called archons, who guard the boundaries between the material world and the higher realms. These archons will present themselves as divine. They will radiate light. They will claim authority. They will demand that the soul identify itself by name and origin. And Jesus instructs James to refuse. Do not give them your name. Do not acknowledge their authority. Do not follow their light. The text provides specific passwords and responses James must use at each checkpoint. The structure is almost identical to the Egyptian model. A journey through a series of obstacles, each requiring specific knowledge to pass. But the Gnostic texts add a dimension the Egyptian and Tibetan sources only imply. The Apocryphon of John, another Nag Hammadi text, catalogued as Codex 2, Tractate 1, describes the archons as having deliberately constructed the material world as a prison for divine sparks, fragments of divine light trapped inside physical bodies. The archons maintain this prison by ensuring that when a body dies, the spark inside it does not escape upward to its true origin. Instead, the archons intercept the spark at the moment of death, present it with a false light, and redirect it back into another body. The cycle of birth, death, and rebirth is not a natural process in the Gnostic framework. It is a farming operation. The archons harvest the energy produced by consciousness trapped in material form, and the false light at the moment of death is the mechanism that keeps the harvest going. This framework is disturbing not because of its theological implications, but because of how precisely it maps onto the Egyptian and Tibetan descriptions. All three traditions describe a light at death that is not what it appears to be. All three provide specific countermeasures designed to help the deceased avoid following it. All three describe the consequence of following the false light as a loss of identity or a return to a state the soul has been in before. The Egyptian House of Forgetting strips the soul of its name and memory. The Tibetan 6 realms recycle consciousness into another incarnation without any recollection of previous lives. The Gnostic archons redirect the divine spark into a new body where it will forget its origin. Three different descriptions of the same outcome. Consciousness trapped in a repeating cycle, unaware that the cycle is repeating, because each transit through the false light erases the memory of the previous one. Now, the skeptical reading of all this deserves to be stated fully, because it is not without force. Comparative mythology has long recognized that cultures separated by time and geography can produce similar mythological motifs through shared cognitive architecture. Humans everywhere fear death. Humans everywhere experience light as a symbol of safety and darkness as a symbol of danger. A narrative in which the dying person must navigate between true and false lights could emerge independently in any culture that has a sufficiently developed concept of an afterlife journey. Carl Jung proposed the concept of archetypes, universal patterns embedded in the collective unconscious that surface in myth, dream, and religious imagery across all cultures. The false light at death could be an archetypal motif, a pattern generated by the structure of the human mind itself, rather than by contact with an external reality. The convergence would then reflect not a shared observation, but a shared neurology. That is a reasonable position. It accounts for the similarity without requiring transmission or shared experience, but it does not account for the specificity. Archetypes are by definition general. They produce broad patterns: the hero, the shadow, the trickster, the threshold. What they do not produce is operational detail. They do not produce passwords. They do not produce the precise grammatical construction you wear the light of another. They do not produce a specific warning not to give your name to the beings who confront you. The Egyptian texts provide counterspells. The Tibetan texts provide visualization sequences. The Gnostic texts provide verbal passwords arranged in a specific order corresponding to specific archons at specific checkpoints. These are not broad mythic patterns. These are technical instructions. And technical instructions imply a source of technical knowledge. There is one more piece of evidence that is rarely discussed in this context, because it comes from a field that has no formal relationship to comparative religion. In 1975, Raymond Moody published a book called Life After Life, in which he coined the term near-death experience. Moody documented accounts from patients who had been clinically dead and then resuscitated. The accounts shared common features: a sense of leaving the body and moving through a dark tunnel, an encounter with a brilliant light, and a feeling of profound love or welcome associated with the light. The near-death experience literature is enormous. Thousands of accounts have been collected since Moody's initial publication. The light is the single most consistent element across all of them. It appears in accounts from patients of every cultural background, every religious tradition, and no religious tradition at all. Atheists report the light. Children report the light. Patients under full anesthesia with no measurable brain activity report the light. The standard interpretation of the near-death experience light is that it represents either a genuine spiritual encounter or a neurological artifact produced by a dying brain. The spiritual interpretation treats the light as real and divine. The neurological interpretation attributes it to oxygen deprivation, endorphin release, or random neural firing in the visual cortex. But there is a minority of near-death experience accounts that do not fit either interpretation cleanly. These accounts describe encountering the light and feeling drawn toward it, but then experiencing a moment of recognition in which the light felt wrong. Not evil, not threatening, but wrong in the way a perfectly constructed replica of something familiar is wrong. The details are correct, but the substance is missing. One account, published in the 1997 edition of the Journal of Near-Death Studies, describes a woman who was clinically dead for 4 minutes following cardiac arrest. She reported moving through a dark space toward a brilliant white light. She felt peace. She felt welcome. And then she noticed that the light had a boundary. It ended. Beyond the boundary was something she described only as more real than the light. She turned away from the light and moved toward that boundary. She was resuscitated before she reached it. Her description is strikingly similar to the Bardo Thodal's distinction between the clear light of reality, which is boundless and formless, and the attractive colored lights of the 6 realms, which have edges, shapes, and boundaries. The true light has no form. The false light does. The true light is difficult to bear. The false light is comfortable. None of this constitutes proof of anything. The near-death experience literature is subjective. The ancient texts are products of their cultural contexts. The parallels could be coincidental, archetypal, or neurological. But the pattern is consistent enough and specific enough to warrant the question that Piankov never asked when he stood in that tomb in 1926 and read the warning on the Western Wall. What if the ancient Egyptians were not writing mythology? What if the Tibetan masters were not constructing philosophy? What if the Gnostic scribes were not composing theology? What if all 3 traditions were documenting an observable phenomenon and providing technical countermeasures against a genuine hazard encountered at the point of death? The hieroglyphic determinative on that Western Wall in the Valley of the Kings was not the sun disk. It was the glyph for a net, a snare, something that catches what passes through it. The scribe who carved that glyph made a deliberate choice. The light depicted on the wall could have been labeled with any of a dozen determinatives associated with divine radiance. The scribe chose the one that means trap. Spell 164 survived in only a handful of copies. The Coffin Text passage describing the face that devours appears in fewer than a dozen coffins. The pyramid text utterance about the House of Forgetting was carved in a single pyramid that was sealed and buried. The Gnostic texts were hidden in a jar and buried in the desert. The Bardo Thodal was concealed inside a cave for 6 centuries. Every tradition that contains this warning treated the warning itself as something that needed to be hidden, not from enemies or competing religions, but from the general population. The knowledge was preserved, but it was preserved quietly, in sealed tombs, in buried jars, in hidden caves, in texts that only initiates were permitted to read. The people who possessed this knowledge did not broadcast it, they protected it. And they protected it for a specific audience, not for the living, for the dying. The texts were placed in tombs because tombs are where the information would be needed. The spells were written on coffin lids because the person lying inside would be the one who needed to read them. The Bardo Thodol was designed to be read aloud to a dying person because the dying person was the one who would encounter the light. The knowledge was not academic. It was operational, and it was time to arrive at the exact moment it became relevant. Piankoff's photographs remain at Princeton. The Papyrus of Ani remains at the British Museum. Fragment 4, Q203 of the Book of Enoch remains at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. The Nag Hammadi codices remain at the Coptic Museum in Cairo. The Bardo Thodol remains in active liturgical use in Tibetan Buddhist communities worldwide, read aloud beside the beds of the dying exactly as Padmasambhava intended. 5 traditions, 3 continents, 3,000 years of composition. 1 warning. The light you see when you die may not be what you think it is. And every ancient culture that left instructions for the dead made sure that warning was the one piece of knowledge that survived above all others. Not how to live, not how to pray, not how to please the gods. How to recognize a trap in the moment when recognition is the only thing that can save you. The scribe who carved that western wall in the Valley of the Kings left the determinative for a net beside the brightest light in the entire painted sequence. That was not an error or artistic convention. That was a message, and the message has been sitting in a sealed tomb for 3,000 years, waiting for someone to read it and understand what it means. The tomb is still sealed. The photographs are still in the archive. The glyph is still there, pressed into limestone by a hand that understood something about death that modern science has not yet confirmed and ancient religion chose to hide. The net is still set, the light is still shining, and the warning is still exactly where they left it.